Think forward. Think Research Channel.
Major funding for this program was provided by the William S. Paley Foundation. Additional support was provided by the Tulane University Department of History, the Tulane University Department of Classics, and the A.B. Freeman School of Business.
Privilege and my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. Our two speakers tonight are Fred S. Naiden, who received his PhD from Harvard in classics, who taught for a number of years as an assistant professor here at Tulane University in classics, and who is now an assistant professor of history at the University of North Carolina. He's author of a book entitled Ancient Supplication, which was published in 2004, and the main focus of his interest is ancient religious and ancient military history. He actually knows a little bit of Phoenician, which is enough because there's very little Phoenician left to read. Our second speaker today is Professor Kenneth S. Harl. He attended graduate school at Yale University long ago, where we were colleagues, back in the third quarter of the last century. He has been at Tulane University now for 30 years. He's won a number of teaching prizes here. He works mainly in the area of coinage and politics in Roman antiquity, has published 2 books on the subject, and has a 3rd book underway on the coinage of the excavations at Gordium. The first speaker, Fred Naiden, will be speaking on Phoenicia and Israel.
This then is the title for the talk, Lebanon and its money, and in particular, the relation between Phoenicia and Israel in ancient times. By way of preface, though, I would like to point out that among the many young countries in the world, Lebanon is one of the older ones, dating from 1943. Since then, of course, Lebanon has suffered 2 civil wars. They total 20 years. It has suffered an even longer Syrian occupation, add 2 Israeli invasions, and now 2 independent semi-states within its borders, the refugee camps of the PLO and the home grounds of Hezbollah, the Shiite Party of God. If Lebanon expires, neighboring Syria will presumably absorb it. Any immigrants might find homes elsewhere. About 500,000 Lebanese already live in the United States. Since the Lebanese are comparatively prosperous, emigrating will be easy. But emigration is not a temptation for the Lebanese alone. It is also one for their neighbors, the Israelis. Both peoples are beleaguered, and not just because of headline-making attacks. They have common problems that long antedate any attacks. In a region of poor Muslim states, Lebanon is rich and multi-denominational, and Israel is rich and Jewish. Most states in the region do not have ancient forebears, but Lebanon and Israel do. Phoenicia was ancient Lebanon, and the kingdom of David and his successors was ancient Israel. Like modern Lebanon, Phoenicia was commercial, and like modern Israel, the kingdom of David was distinctive in its religion. For both Lebanese and Israelis, immigration is a response to historic burdens as well as contemporary tensions. But the differences between these 2 countries and their neighbors would not lead to emigration were it not for another obvious topographical factor. Both countries are small and marginal. Their neighbors can imagine obliterating them. Some of the attacks, of course, have this aim. Whether the coast of the Mediterranean thrives depends upon which way this region orients itself. When it faces westward and southward towards the Mediterranean, it tends to be either free or subject to some distant Western empire. It also tends to prosper. What is now Lebanon serves as a link among Egypt, the rest of the Mediterranean, and the interior of Asia. Until the 19th century and the advent of large stocks of paper money, this orientation spelled stocks of specie and sound, widely circulating currency in the form of coinage. When change does come and the region looks eastward, It not only becomes subject to some Asian empire, it also trades less to the west and the south. Until the 19th century, this orientation spelled unsound local coinage. A change in orientation does not do away with national differences. Lebanon is an emporium, but Israel, which lies somewhat to the side, is not. And so the swing from wealth to poverty is characteristically Lebanese. Israel lacks protective mountains, and so armies that make slow progress in Lebanon tend to make quick progress to the south. These armies also tend to reach Lebanon first. That, plus Lebanon's wealth, makes it the first country to reorient itself. Century after century, Israel comes second. The story of Lebanon is also the story of Israel, the laggard, pious, rural cousin. This story begins around 1400 BC. For mostly unknown reasons, the great empires of Asia in this period collapsed. This map shows some of the results. At this point, the Hittite, Babylonian, and Egyptian armies withdrew from Lebanon and Syria, and Lebanon oriented itself towards the Mediterranean. The coastal towns became independent, traded in all directions, and grew rich. As far back as the 3rd millennium BCE, they had been middlemen between Sumerian cities and the early kings of Egypt, and they did well during the Egyptian Middle and New Kingdoms of the 2nd millennium BCE. The most famous Lebanese export was the cedars of Mount Lebanon. The Epic of Gilgamesh says that the poem's hero laid claim to these cedars and then, elated by his success, tried to lay claim to another storied resource, eternal life. But the Old Testament makes even more of the cedars. The Hebrews had not failed to notice this Lebanese export and also other features of Phoenician life. They wanted to join the Phoenician trading network, sample the luxuries, and adapt some of the culture. And they found a Phoenician who would assist them, Hiram, the king of Tyre, and Solomon's business partner. Hiram sent Solomon cedarwood as part of the biggest deal between them. Unlike the others, this deal had an architectural and religious side. Like his people, the God of the Hebrews had always lived in a tent. Now Solomon induced Yahweh to live in a house. Canaanite gods did that, and so did Phoenician gods, and the God of the Hebrews would too, and in just as good a house as the rest. Hiram, after all, was going to build this new house, and Hiram set the standard in luxury. But Yahweh was not to be the only house-proud ruler in Israel. Solomon would live in a house as well, another house built by Hiram. He would have a second house built by Hiram for the most prestigious of his wives, the Pharaoh's daughter. This wife's father no doubt expected as much. The Hebrews had never seen the like. This picture conveys the impression that the temple made, even if it exaggerates its size. This impression is one reason that the writers of the first book of Kings and the second book of Chronicles enumerate the cedar, pine, and olive wood, and also the architects, carpenters, fenster makers, furniture makers, goldsmiths, coppersmiths, stonemasons, and sculptors in bronze, and go on to describe gilding the altar and carving the cherubim in the Holy of Holies, yet also fashioning pots and shovels. Another reason is that Hiram and his men built more and better than any Hebrew king could afford. Their work was the beau ideal of the chosen people, built to last as well as to amaze. Hiram's contribution went beyond temples and palaces. Solomon began to worship Astarte, Hiram's tutelary goddess, one commonly likened to the Greek Aphrodite, although this picture shows her resemblance to another Greek goddess, the mistress of the animals. In succeeding generations, more Phoenician polytheism made its way to the Hebrews. The best-known evangelist for the Phoenician gods was Jezebel, a Phoenician princess married to Ahab, king of the northern Hebrew kingdom of Israel. She was very unlike the impious sinner that her name would imply. Mindful of the gods whom she had worshipped in Phoenicia, she no sooner came to Israel than she built a temple to another Phoenician god, Baal, the Zeus of their pantheon. Ahab followed her example and erected an image of Asherah, Baal's consort. Ahab's idolatry makes him the worst of all Hebrew kings, the Deuteronomist insists, and the numbers bear this out. Ahab and Jezebel kept 650 retainers charged with worshiping Baal and Asherah, the largest retinue mentioned in the Old Testament. Jezebel was learned also. Even the Deuteronomist concedes that she used written correspondence to bring about the death of a Hebrew vineyard owner whose property she supposedly coveted. Since her letters were read by Hebrew elders, the Phoenician alphabet was now spreading to Israel. Jezebel may even have written in Phoenician and not in Hebrew. It would hardly matter which, for at this point the difference between the two alphabets was slight. And so the Deuteronomist is doubly hard on Jezebel. Although Ahab is conceded to be a popular ruler, she is hated. Her own son cannot abide her God and her scribbling, and so he defenestrates her. Down to Ahab's and Jezebel's time, or 850 BCE, the Phoenicians enjoyed centuries of liberty and prosperity. Unlike previous important societies in the Levant, they conquered scarcely anyone. Save among their neighbors, the Hebrews, they scarcely proselytized. A society like modern Lebanon, a commercial if not secular society, emerged centuries ahead of any similar society such as the Greek city-states or the commercial cities and regions of Western Europe. It could not last, and in the following centuries, Phoenicia lost its freedom and some of its wealth. Just as the states of the Near East collapsed around 1400, Persia collapsed. This time, the reason for the collapse is known. Alexander the Great conquered Persia in 10 years, including a conquest of Phoenicia that took less than a single year. The Phoenicians now did an about-face, and for a second time oriented themselves towards the Mediterranean. In two respects, their new Western orientation had the same effect as the earlier one. They would prosper and they would enjoy autonomy. In other respects, the new orientation had a less happy effect. Rather than be independent, the Phoenician cities would be subject to a European ruler. They would also use coins, as just shown, and no longer use the talents and shekels of Hiram and Solomon. They would, in addition, be Hellenized. They would rejoin the Mediterranean, but on new terms. Once Alexander left Asia Minor and reached the rest of the continent, he had targeted Phoenicia. As the home base of the Persian navy, it threatened his rear, and it lay on the road to Egypt. To avoid losses, most of the cities surrendered to him. They preferred commerce to war. Tyre, however, remembered its successful resistance to the Assyrians and also to Nebuchadnezzar, who had besieged it for 13 years. It decided to let Alexander occupy the mainland, but not the adjacent island. Alexander answered by seizing the mainland and attacking the island too. An attempt to build a mole to the island failed, in spite of the shallow water, and so Alexander attacked from the sea. This image on the left shows the mole. Catapults that Alexander put aboard ships swept the walls of the island of their defenders and made a breach where Alexander landed Macedonian light infantry supported by archers and spearmen from the Upper Balkans. This was the first use of naval artillery in support of an amphibious landing, and the first use of Marines transported long distances overseas. It was also the first important attack on Phoenicia from the Mediterranean. Alexander had set precedents for Romans, Crusaders, and the U.S. Navy. And unlike Nebuchadnezzar, he had succeeded. Not even the mole was a failure. It laid the foundation for the landfill that now connects the island and the mainland, as shown on the right-hand side of this pair of pictures. Alexander also set another precedent for Romans, Crusaders, and moderns. He partially monetized the markets of Phoenicia. He gave Persian specie captured at Damascus to the Phoenician cities and bade them issue Macedonian-style coins in his name. Aradus, Byblos, Sidon, all cities that surrendered without a fight, turned specie into gold and silver coins. Beirutus, modern Beirut, joined in and became another financial center. To assure the autonomy of the cities, Alexander declined to appoint a satrap or provincial governor. Alexander wanted Phoenicia's revenue, so he did appoint a tax collector, but he did not centralize the administration. He also allowed a new king in Tyre. Having proven more successful than earlier conquerors, he arrogated to himself the privilege of being more lenient. Nor did the Phoenicians fail to gain their share of the money spent by the Diadochi, the successors of Alexander, who divided the Macedonian Empire after his death in 323. These rulers let the Phoenicians issue coins made from Persian specie, taken from the great reserves in Iran. The Phoenicians also profited from supplying navies and supplies to their Macedonian overlords. One customer was Ptolemy I, the successor who came to power in Egypt, and who ruled Phoenicia around 300 BCE. Under this ruler, the first Egyptian to rule Phoenicia since the middle of the second millennium, Tyre rebounded and joined other cities in issuing coins in his honor. These coins were as Macedonian in style as all the others. In this pair of images, Ptolemy is styled as Basileus, Greek for king, and he appropriates Zeus's familiar, the eagle. When other successors, the Seleucids, seized the Phoenician ports a century later, the cities were no less assiduous in serving this second master, whose power centered on Syria and Mesopotamia. The Seleucids, too, were and remained Macedonian, the same as the successors in Egypt. minting coins, furnishing naval stores, building and manning ships. All this prosperity resulted from the Macedonian conquest and Macedonian rule from a new kind of western and southern orientation for Phoenicia. Yet the cities were autonomous, not free, and their prosperity depended more on small business than it had before. The reason? Coins made small business easier. Markets grew and replaced palaces like Hieroms as the seats of commerce. All these changes ran parallel to innovations in government. The Phoenician cities of Hierom's time had kings and also councils of elders, the same as the biblical Hebrews, but there is no evidence that they had any assemblies before the Macedonian conquest. Greek cities did have assemblies. Oligarchic cities like Corinth had them, the same as democratic ones like Athens. Like coins, assemblies were good for small business. Regulations passed by assemblies fostered both trade and handicrafts, and so did assembly spending on temples. Now the Phoenicians added assemblies to their monarchies and councils. They had accepted two Greek imports, coins and assemblies. Coins happen to illustrate this shift. An assembly in Sidon, for example, would refer to itself on Sidonian coins as the Sidonians. Here we can see the word written in Greek on the right-hand side. On the other side, the headdress of the Greek goddess Tuke, or fortune, sports pillars that represent the walls of the city. Tuke, of course, is a third Greek import. Even the language of this coin is Greek, a fourth import. The Phoenicians were Hellenizing. The iconography of these coins shows more Hellenizing. Just as Athens had its owls, Tyre had its murex shells and hippocamp. Where an owl appears, as it does on the right, it is accompanied by a flail and a crook, two Near Eastern symbols of kingship. But one has the impression, looking at this, that the owl is prevailing over these older symbols. The silver coins of Aratus and elsewhere carry a youthful Heracles, one of Alexander's supposed ancestors, wearing a lion's skin. The reverse bears an enthroned Zeus. Heracles, as it happened, was sometimes identified with one of the Phoenicians' own gods, Melkart. This coin bears an image of Melkart with a Herculean lion skin, showing how the identification could be easy. Many Greek authors indeed made this identification, and so did Alexander himself. Alexander's successors ruled the Hebrews. But Hebrew religious particularism, evident in the treatment given to Jezebel, was again evident in the response to the new Phoenician religious innovation of Hellenism. The Hebrews rejected it. The Phoenicians, who had always differed from the Hebrews economically, would now differ from them culturally. Greek response to the two peoples varied accordingly. The Phoenicians were so rich, said the geographer Strabo, that there were more tall buildings in Tyre than in Rome. And they were so smart, said Herodotus, that they invented the alphabet. Perhaps they had circumnavigated Africa. Perhaps they had lied about it. The Phoenicians were better at being Greek than the Greeks were, and the Greeks resented it. The Hebrews, however, did not attempt to be Greeks, and so, prior to the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek in Alexandria in the early 3rd century BCE, Greek literature does not mention the Hebrews. The laggard cousin is beneath notice. First, the Phoenicians had been free and rich in specie. Then they had been gradually subjected and impoverished by Asian rulers. Then they had been subjected again, but to Alexander, and had been enriched and also Hellenized. But they had never been united, save by foreigners. There were Phoenician enclaves, but no Phoenician state. Phoenicia was not a political term, only a topographical one. In this regard, Phoenicia was like the ancient Jewish homeland. It, too, was not usually a political term. There had been a united kingdom under David and Solomon, but not for long, and not without Phoenician help. Another united kingdom, that of the Maccabees, was also short-lived. This pattern would continue long after the Macedonians lost power, and Romans, Byzantines, Franks, and Arabs replaced them. Independence would be rare, and so would unity. Scale would be small. Tides of foreign influence would go in and out. The highest tide, however, would come from Rome.
The next paper will be on coinage in the cities of Lebanon under Rome, the genesis of Phoenicianism. Professor Harl.
Well, to follow up on Fred's paper, the Phoenicians found in imperial Rome a distant, western, and very favorable overlord, so that the famed cities of Phoenicia, that would be Beirut, which is today modern Beirut, Sidon, Tyre, Byblos, enjoyed prosperity unmatched until the 20th century. Phoenician cities flourished under the Roman peace because they were conduits of goods exchanged between the Mediterranean world and the Near East. The luxury goods arrived from the west by sea and from the east by caravan routes from India, Central Asia, and Han China. As homes of Latin-speaking residents of Roman colonies, the Phoenician cities looked westward evermore. At the same time were sown the seeds of later Phoenicianism, a topic that will reappear in modern times, or the evocation, even the invention, of a Phoenician past to give an antiquity and a legitimacy which was created for the benefit of Rome. In 63 BC, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known to us as Pompey the Great, organized the Greater Levant into the province of Syria. You can see the province there on the map. The province embraced all of modern-day Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, along with southeastern Turkey, regions most recently under the rule of the Seleucid kings, who were descendants of a general of Alexander the Great and who had ruled from Antioch, which is modern Antakya. The Phoenician cities were administered within this theater of operations, for such was a Roman province, and it was under the command of a Roman legate of Syria, a senior commander of senatorial rank. Rome's legate imposed a new unity over the numerous city-states and principalities of the Levant. The legions under his command took up billets in the cities of northern Syria, and they mounted guard against a distant eastern foe, the Arsacid king of Parthia, who ruled the Middle Eastern lands beyond the Euphrates. By Pompey's time, the Phoenician cities had already transformed themselves, at least outwardly, into Hellenic city-states, or polis, in their public institutions and activities. From the late 2nd century BC on, as Seleucid power weakened, the cities of Sidon, Tripolis, Beirut, today Beirut, Tyre, minted their own silver coins in an impeccably Greek guise. You see here a large silver coin coined by Tyre from specie obtained in trade, and the coin passed current as the prime trade coin in markets of the Eastern Mediterranean. And it also passed far beyond the frontiers of Rome in the cities of the Near East. These coins of Tyre bore on the obverse the youthful head of the Phoenician Melkart, that is the civic god of Tyre, and he's cast as a Hellenic god who resembles Alexander the Great. On the reverse strides a heroic eagle, the emblem of Zeus, and it's inspired after the Ptolemaic coinage of Egypt. This money of Tyre became synonymous with fine silver. And Tyre coined money with these civic types, that is, these images, down to the reign of the Emperor Nero. And even the otherwise fiercely aniconic Jews overcame their dislike of images by accepting these coins for temple dues and rents, or, in the case of Judas, the price of the betrayal of Jesus. These were the 30 pieces of silver that Judas received. In 66 AD, the silver provincial coinage of Syria was simplified so that the silver coins henceforth carried the portrait of the emperor, but it was still struck on the standard of Tyre with the portrait of, eagle on the reverse. And here you see a later imperial version of that coin minted in the reign of the Emperor Caracalla, over 150 years later. Tyre's silver coins symbolized how Phoenician cities reinvented themselves as a result of the prosperity of the Hellenistic world, the order that was forged by Alexander the Great. The hereditary princes were replaced by elected magistrates and councils of property classes that governed by constitutions after the manner of Greek cities. The Canaanite language of the Phoenicians, which is a dialect close to Hebrew, gave way to Aramaic, then to Greek. Phoenicians thus acquired as their mother tongues the two commercial languages of the Hellenistic age, and in so doing they forgot their Phoenician language and literature. Most likely these were ritual texts rather than belles lettres. What survived were those pieces of Phoenician lore readily accommodated into myths, legends, and histories of the wider Greek world. Hence native heroes, heroines, gods were reinvented in Greek guises. On a coin of Sidon here of the imperial age, we see Europa depicted as carried off to Greece by Zeus, who is in his guise as a bull. The Sidonians thus made what was originally a Greek tale their own. The witty Lucian of Samosata, writing in the 2nd century AD, commented that Sidon's temple to Astarte honored the goddess who was the sister of Europa, and that was on the previous coin that I showed. Lucian fails to mention that this goddess, if you ever knew, was actually Astarte, the Canaanite version of Ishtar. Instead, Lucian, himself a native of Roman Syria, stressed only what was familiar to his Greek readership. And if you notice on the bottom, there is a modern coin of Greece issued under the European Union, a €2 piece that celebrates the origins of Europe with the same myth. And I often wonder if Lebanon had entered into the European Union, whether this type may have been taken as a way of emphasizing Lebanon's connections to the West, and that we won't know. In 30 BC, Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, trekked east in the wake of his defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Octavian found these Phoenician port cities reinvented as Greek cities, and this was comforting to Rome, because Rome thought in terms of cities. In the eastern half of the Roman Empire, Greek cities were favored because, after all, they were the sources of so much Roman civilization. And the astute Greek-speaking merchant bankers and magistrates of the Lebanese cities pointed out to Octavian their antiquity and respectability, as verified in Greek tradition and by being certifiably Phoenician. Augustus elevated the leading city of city of Phoenicia, Berytus, today Beirut, to colonial rank, that is, to a Roman colony. He settled Roman soldiers, remodeled the city after Italian cities. His reasons were strategic. The port of Berytus was crucial to Roman control of the Levant, but as you can see from the city coin, the image is thoroughly Roman in its design. Roman immigrants joined the native residents to form a new citizen body, enrolled in one of the 35 tribes of the Roman people. Latin was adopted as the official language, that is the language of that particular coin. Architecture and public life shifted very much to a Roman guise, which you can see on a later coin struck by the same colony in the reign of Elagabalus. This new legal status of Phoenician cities in the Roman Empire is thus well seen on the coins, the bronze coins they were permitted to strike. And these coins I'm showing you were minted as on the permission of Rome to be used as local fractional currency. So that the arrangements of money in what is today Lebanon, in fact in the entire Roman East, was very similar to those arrangements that the British Raj permitted in India, where native states could issue their own money, which would be used in tandem with the imperial gold and silver money. The coins of Phoenician cities are telling thus for two reasons. The denominational values here are Roman. The numerous types, that is pictures and legends, that is inscriptions, represent a Roman provincial identity. And for example, the coin I showed you earlier was a coin showing Augustus plowing the Pomerium, that is the sacred limit of the city of Rome according to the Etruscan rite. In effect, Augustus was playing the role of a Romulus to a mini Phoenician Rome. The grant of colonial rank was eventually extended to all the major cities of Phoenicia, and it proved more than just a legal status. Inscriptions prove that citizens took the peculiar Roman nomenclature, the three names, the tria nomina, designating an individual, a clan, or gens in Latin, and the family. Lebanese cities repeatedly occupied, destroyed, leveled, and rebuilt, preserved few of the monuments or look of when they were Roman cities, and hence we turn to these coins. Augustus confirmed strongman Herod the Great to rule over the turbulent lands of the Jews, Samaritans, and pagans, a region that the Romans would have called Palestine and not to be confused with the modern usage. Herod is not fondly remembered in either the Jewish or Christian tradition, but Herod kept order, and he so protected the strategic coastal highway of the Levant. He was a loyal friend of Rome, a Greek aristocrat in speech and in aesthetics, a Jew in faith, and a savvy prince. Upon his first meeting with Cleopatra, Herod accused the queen of attempting to seduce him. She countered with the allegation that Herod had conspired to poison her. They were both right. In the Jewish homeland, Rome found few cities upon which to base her administration. Roman colonies and Greek cities were only planted in the Jewish homeland after repeated nationalist revolts, and you can see here a Roman coin proclaiming the captivity of Judea after the first great Jewish rebellion in the reign of Vespasian. The Jewish nationalists expressed their own attitude towards Rome, especially in the Second Great Revolt, by overstriking, that is, striking over the existing coins of Tyre with their own types, proclaiming the liberation of Judea, of Israel, and featuring the menorah, the symbol of Judaism reborn against the hated Roman oppressor. From the reign of Hadrian, leading aristocrats from eastern provinces entered the equestrian and senatorial orders, that is, the two rungs of the imperial aristocracy. And so they entered the halls of power in the imperial capital itself. On New Year's Eve, 192, the crazed Emperor Commodus was murdered. And for the last 4 years of his reign, Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, behaved increasingly tyrannically after he had emerged from a mental collapse in which he came out of it convinced he was the god Hercules reborn. And frankly, the historical Commodus is far more interesting as a diabolical and bizarre and dangerous ruler than the one depicted on the screen in Gladiator. They should have stuck with the sources rather than invented the one they came up with. Civil wars raged across the empire after the death of Commodus, and the eventual victor of this was an emperor called Septimius Severus, scion of a provincial noble family from Leptis Magna, an old Phoenician colony in Libya, that is North Africa today. In descent, Septimius Severus counted Italian, Punic, perhaps Berber ancestors. In speech and outlook, he was a proud Roman aristocrat. He was a product of the imperial system, and he advanced his career under the suspicious Commodus, no small feat. Yet the new emperor was also conscious of his provincial origins, and he promoted men who hailed from the cities of Roman North Africa, that is, old Punic colonies. He also favored the cities of Phoenicia, and we'll get to that in a moment, notably the city of Tyre. In part, he acted out of calculated policy rather than sentimental Phoenicianism. In 193-194, during the first round of the Civil War, Tyre declared its loyalty for Septimius Severus against the other candidate, Pescennius Niger, who was the governor of Roman Syria and declared emperor by the Eastern Legions. Pescennius Niger had meted out harsh punishment to Tyre, so when Septimius won the Civil War, Tyre was rewarded with the grant of colonial rank, the coveted legal status of jus Italicum, that is the Italian right. That is, Tyre was now turned into essentially Italian soil, exempt from direct taxes, and above all, as we see on the coins here, the right to issue its own bronze money in Latin as a Roman colony, featuring the new imperial games, Actia Heraclea. These were the city games of Melkart, the long identified with Roman Heracles and now identified with Roman Hercules, and the games celebrated the Battle of Actium, the defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and the founding of the Roman world. It elevated Tyre into a charmed elite circle of schools, of cities in the Roman world. Contestants would come for the musical, athletic, and literary events. Visitors were sure to break all previous records. And the result is that Tyre got the equivalent in U.S. terms of a city that obtained its first and winning NFL team. The rising fortunes of the Phoenician cities owed more to the wife of Septimius Severus, perhaps, the Empress Julia Domna, whom you see here in both sculpture and coin. She was the beautiful daughter of Julius Bassianus, the Roman equestrian and hereditary priest of the solar cult of Baal, and that is the god of Hiram, of which Professor Naiden just spoke. Bassianus administered the shrine of Amisa, Homs, today in the Orontes Valley in Syria, where Baal was conceived as an aniconic Baitel, probably some kind of meteorite that might have fallen from the heavens, and the sacred object graced both the local and Roman imperial coins. The later Severan emperors, the ones that followed Septimius and his sons, Elagabalus and Severus Alexander, likewise favored the Phoenician cities, which were raised to colonial rank. Severan emperors cemented these ties with the Phoenician cities as they did with other eastern cities, because so many members of the senatorial order, that is, men who staffed the imperial administration, now came from the eastern cities, perhaps 1/3 by the Severan age. And it is an important fact to keep in mind that these eastern aristocrats, from what is today Western Turkey, from the Lebanon, and from northern Syria, that they accepted and served the Roman monarchy, and eventually they would dictate the focus of the Roman monarchy and even remove the emperor from Rome on the Tiber to the New Rome on the Bosporus, that is today Constantinople or Istanbul in the time of Constantine. The Severan emperors also rested their power on a professional army. The final words of Septimius Severus to his sons Caracola and Geta here is, enrich the soldiers, despise the rest. Shortly after the succession of the two brothers in 212, Caracola murdered Geta, and then out of pathological hatred ordered his brother's image erased and all sorts of monuments. Here you see a coin where Gita's image has been erased, and a tondo from Egypt where the younger brother's picture is later scratched out. Caracalla turn came in 217 when he was ignominiously murdered by his Praetorian prefect, a man named Macrinus. But shortly after that, Julia Maesa, the sister of Julia Domna, the younger sister of Julia Domna, rallied the Eastern legions to the Severan dynasty. She had two grandsons by two different daughters, and the older of the two, Elagabalus, was accepted as the new Severan emperor, the new Caracalla. Here you see that emperor Elagabalus, who's actually officially known as Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, on an imperial coin. The reign of Elagabalus proved a fiasco. He was a spoiled adolescent prince, zealous in his devotion to the Phoenician god Baal, which he introduced to Rome along with orgiastic rites. Imperial coins here show the reception of the ancient Canaanite Phoenician god into the city in his sacred chariot. The Phoenician priest king turned emperor turned the Vestal virgins into a sacred harem. He overreached himself when he announced that he was going to marry the Baal of Amisa, his hometown, with the goddess Tanat, the goddess of Carthage, the new Tyre in Africa, and the reception of these Phoenician gods in their traditional guise was just unacceptable. And it provoked a reaction more hostile than anything you would find in Hebrew scriptures towards the idols. Elagabalus outraged the Senate, the bureaucracy, the army, the urban mob, and eventually was torn to pieces in a riot. But the ever-astute Julia Maesa had another grandson whom she advanced. This is the son of her younger daughter, Julia Maema. You can see them depicted on imperial coins. A man named Severus Alexander, an adolescent actually, and he ruled in an impeccably Roman way and invoked not the god of Amisa, not the Baal of King Hiram, but rather the god Jupiter, Jupiter Conservator, the preserver of Rome. However, the cult of Baal was returned to Phoenicia, and that particular cult still favored Roman emperors. It was perfectly okay if it stayed in a Phoenician city, but really didn't belong in Rome. And in 272, a later Roman emperor called Aurelian credited his victory in the east to this very god, and you see him issuing coins in honor of that god, depicted as the Roman equivalent of Sol Invictus, that is the unconquerable sun, who is a comrade of the Roman emperor. With the murder of Severus Alexander and Julia Domna in 235, not only did the Severan dynasty end, but the Roman Empire was plunged into political and military crisis for the next 50 years. This crisis propelled Rome out of classical antiquity into the early Middle Ages. Yet even in the changed world of Rome, the cities of Phoenicia retain their pivotal role in the Mediterranean economy, and that is becoming clear in studying the coins and the archaeological evidence at Phoenician cities in late antiquity. Furthermore, these cities continued as centers for brilliant productions of letters and arts. It should be noted that Ammianus Marcellinus, a pagan soldier writing under Roman emperors in the 4th century, and in many ways the last great historian of imperial Rome, was perhaps born in Antioch, that is in northern Syria, may have been trained at Berytus, and really was a representative of this provincial Lebanese Syrian population. Thank you.
Professor Harl will be back to discuss the Crusader period in Phoenicia. For the time being, however, we're going to have an interlude to allow him to catch his breath and to prepare himself for that. And what I'd like to do is just for a moment look back on the first two papers. They have this in common. Phoenicia is fragile. If it faces east to Asia, it's a backwater of no significance. If it faces west, either because the Asian powers are weak and disunited, and the Phoenician cities, which are really separate areas separated by mountains, are independent, it prospers. It also prospers if there is an imperial power based in the Mediterranean, whether it be the Macedonians or the later Romans. This prosperity is extraordinary. It is fabulous. And it's a prosperity that is restricted to small cities along a coast between the mountains and the sea that are safely marginal, no threats to anyone. In the early period, it produces a great deal of bullion for the people who live in the Phoenician cities. Later, it will produce coins. Lebanon has always been known for its food, and Professor Harl tells us that in the period in which Lebanon is important under the Roman Empire, they bring in something called garum, which is a kind of spicy mix of rotting fish guts. Tonight, after this is over, we will be going to a Tunisian restaurant. Tunisia is a place that's major city once upon a time was Carthage. Carthage was an extension of ancient Phoenicia. I fear that before the evening is over, I will be eating rotten fish guts. Now we will have Professor Harl, who will tell us about the money of Outramer, Crusader Lebanon.
I'm going to deal with Outre-mer, that is overseas in French, Crusader Lebanon. In the autumn of 636, Al-Khalid, the sword of Islam, and his Bedouin warriors astride camels were received in triumph in the city of Damascus. Soon afterwards, they entered Emesa, home of the Severan emperors of Rome, of whom I just spoke. Between 634 and 637, Arab armies under the banner of Islam occupied all the cities of the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire, and they also overran the Persian Empire in what is today Iran and Central Asia. In 641, Egypt fell. Between 642 and 698, the Muslim armies relentlessly conquered the lands of North Africa. Within 60 years, Arab armies had conquered the future heartland of Islam between the Indus and the Atlantic Ocean in what must be regarded as one of the most spectacular set of military conquests on record. The proud Roman cities of Lebanon now passed under the rule of the caliphs, the successors of the Prophet of Muhammad. Islamic fleets clashed with the navy of the Orthodox emperors of Byzantium, and that is today Istanbul, medieval Constantinople, or New Rome. And they waged a savage war over the control of the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean. Many Christian Lebanese chose their Christian faith and loyalty to this Byzantine or Greek-speaking Roman emperor over their homes, and they migrated to Asia Minor, into the regions that were still under the control of that Christian emperor. These Mardates settled in ports of southwestern Turkey today, and they still remained a distinct ethnic group down to the 11th century. The first Umayyad caliphs, Muawiyah, launched the first Muslim fleet manned by Christian Lebanese and Egyptian seamen. Muawiyah failed to capture the city of Constantinople after a 4-year siege. His Christian crews deserted when the Byzantines launched ships armed with siphons, squirting out a new dreaded incendiary known as Greek fire. And thereafter, the Caliph Muawiyah concluded an armistice with the Byzantine emperor, and so Islamic armies were now thwarted from conquering Constantinople for the next 8 centuries. The later caliphs removed the center of Islamic power from Damascus to Baghdad in 763, and so they centered Islam on the eastern lands. But they also took important steps that eventually turned Islam into the future faith of what is today the dominant religion of the Middle East. Between the 7th and 10th centuries, the Lebanese ports languished because the caravan trade of the Near East was favored by the caliphs. And in this period, the Mediterranean Sea, you have to understand, was essentially a battlefield between the fleets of Christendom and Islam. To be sure, there was still commerce, and the Lebanese ports did not disappear. Markets and plunder and captives flourished, but the Lebanese cities no longer played that pivotal role in trade between Europe and the Middle East. In fact, over the course of the early Middle Ages, Venetians, Pisans, and Amalfian vessels reappeared in Levantine ports, certainly by the end of the 8th century. We know in the late 820s that the Venetians actually smuggled the bones of St. Mark out of Alexandria by packing the relics in a barrel of pickled pork, which the Muslim customs inspectors would refuse to check. They were already familiar in the Muslim ports. By the 10th century, as the emperor in Constantinople reconquered lands in Asia Minor and Syria, and a Shiite dynasty, the Fatimid caliphs, occupied Egypt and secured the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, the ports of the Levant began to increase in their prosperity and size again. Fatimid Caliph, that is the Caliph of Cairo, who is the counter-caliph to the one ruling in Baghdad, and Byzantine emperor had a common foe in that Sunni caliph in Baghdad. And they together protected Western merchants and pilgrims arriving to the Phoenician ports, Lebanese ports, in ever greater numbers in the 3 generations before the Crusades. Now, as for the question of money, the first 4 Muslim caliphs, the Rashidun caliphs, and then the caliphs of the Umayyad dynasty, initially employed the money of the defeated. And you can see on this slide a gold coin issued by the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius. And then you can see as this money wears out, the Muslims strike their own variety, and you see below a Muslim imitation, that is a version of the Byzantine gold coin, and you notice how the cross has been removed carefully from the reverse so it's not too overtly Christian. The bronze coins are even more blundered. You've got an imperial version above and a Arab imitation below. And for silver coins, they use the coins of the Shahs of Persia, the Sassanid Shahs of Iran, and again, they struck their own versions of that money, which would pass current because it looked like the earlier common money of the Middle East. But in time, these coins were replaced by impeccably Muslim coins. There was a major reform of the currency in 696, and the Caliph Abd al-Malik devised the format of all future Muslim coinage to this day, in which you have are gold and silver coins, dinars and dirhams, carrying not direct quotes, but variations of Quranic verse, surahs, because after all, these coins might pass in the hands of unbelievers. And so from the 8th century on, the populations of the Lebanese cities, which were still largely Christian, were using increasingly Muslim coins. At the same time, these Christian Lebanese under the caliphs lost the carrying trade to the European co-religionists, and these would be notably the citizens of Barcelona, Marseille, and the Italian city-states, above all, Venice and Genoa. So during the 2 centuries before the arrival of the Crusaders, the Muslim world suffered a dearth of silver specie, and so silver coinages across the Middle East were either debased or suspended, contributing to the fiscal weakness of the Abbasid Caliphate, that is the great successor state of Muhammad, that eventually fragmented into regional states. The Fatimid caliphs in Cairo, that is in Egypt, had access to the gold of Nubia, that is of Africa, and struck a well-designed Shiite gold coin. And these coins are distinctly Shiite in their proclamations and iconography, and they were imitated. That is, versions of them were struck in the Lebanese ports and later by Frankish crusaders and Italian merchants when they entered the Muslim world. The first generation of crusaders from Europe brought with them their distinct small hammered coins, as we call them, deniers and obols. These come from the Italian port of Lucca or from central and southern France. They also made use of captured Muslim coins, and they struck versions of those Muslim coins, such as the Fatimid dinar you see here. The Arabic here is essentially nonsense. It looks like a dinar, it works like a dinar, it's good enough. In the 13th century, as prosperity soared, they needed larger multiple silver coins. Again, they turned to Western Europe, and they issued what is known as the grosso or gros, English groat. You can see a Crusader version of it from the county of Tripoli, and you have its prototype, a French gros tourné of St. Louis IX of France. As these imported coins started to wear out, the Frankish kings of Jerusalem issued their own their own deniers, their own feudal coins, and King Baldwin III, who, while he was the 4th ruler in the Crusader state of Jerusalem, the kingdom of Jerusalem, he represented the 2nd generation, and he had been born in the East, And he was the one who brought in the first native-struck coins of Jerusalem, modeled after Western deniers. And this was significant for several reasons. These coins were ideal for paying rents, feudal dues, especially those collected in the so-called money fiefs. That is the system of obligation in Western Europe, which would have been labor services, is very quickly converted into payments in silver in the Levant. And above all, Baldwin III pursued a very ambitious building program that required this money. He undertook the rebuilding of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, transforming it from a Byzantine church into a magnificent Romanesque cathedral, complete with a bell tower. At the same time, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem was rebuilt. This is, by the way, the much later modern rebuilding of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as it looks today. It was remodeled successively since about 1550. The new coinage paid for these buildings. And in many ways, the money and building program of Baldwin III represented a Christian version of that relationship that had linked the Phoenician cities in the Hebrew kingdom of Judah and Israel in the early Iron Age. In this case, Baldwin III combined the roles of both King Solomon and King Hiram. It is ironic that the Crusaders arrived to worship at the two holiest churches in the Christian tradition, but they stayed to hold the Lebanese ports. The ports were vital for the defense of the region, but they were even more vital for revenues. In the Lebanese ports, the Crusaders gained the basis of their prosperity in the 12th century and their ability to revive in the 13th century after a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Hattin in 1187. The Crusader princes were always hard-pressed by the Seljuk Turks, and they had repeatedly appealed for assistance against the Seljuk ruler of Mosul, Zengi, who in 1144 captured the city of Edessa, that is the northern Crusader state, and blotted it out, the northern bastion of the Christian East. In response, the two mightiest monarchs of Europe, Louis VII of France and the aspiring Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III of Germany, set out on the Second Crusade. The brilliant Eleanor of Aquitaine, who reputedly rode at the head of her ladies dressed as Amazons and so scandalized her drab monkish husband Louis, also had an enormous amount of fun setting out on this, and it resulted in the divorce of the two monarchs when they got back to Europe. Eleanor married the more dazzling Henry Plantagenet, who ascended the English throne and would go on to rule the British Isles and two-thirds of France to the grief of Louis. In Outremer, the Second Crusade ended in a fiasco, an attempted siege at Damascus that failed, and it allowed Zengi's son Nur ad-Din to unite the Turkish states of Mosul, Aleppo, and Damascus into a single powerful Turkoman state. In 1169, Saladin, the Kurdish lieutenant of Nur ad-Din, occupied Egypt. And 2 years later, he ended the Shiite caliphate there, and the name of the Sunni Abbasid caliph was once again proclaimed at Friday prayers in the Great Mosque of Cairo. Master and lieutenant were bound to clash, but Nur ad-Din died of fever in 1174, and Saladin fell heir to a powerful state stretching from the upper Tigris, in what is today essentially eastern Turkey, to the Nile Valley. And he now had the means to drive the Franks of the shore, that is the Crusaders, into the sea. But Saladin faced two problems within his own kingdom. First, as the guardian of the Sunni Islamic tradition and the caliph, Saladin was hated by the Shiite sectarians that turned to the Grand Master of the Ishmaelites, who ruled from the mountain fastness in northern Iran. The Ishmaelites were a branch of Seveners Shi'ism, and they plotted to overthrow Sunni Islam and bring about the moral redemption of Islam under a true imam. To this end, they set out hit squads, the so-called assassins, based supposedly on the fact that zealots smoked hashish to get them excited about killing a target and then being cut down themselves. Twice Saladin barely escaped assassin daggers, and the connection between the Shiite sectarians and the Iranian religious elite goes back well into the 12th and 13th century and persists to this day. Second, Saladin, as a Kurdish officer turned sultan, was disliked by his own officers of the Turkish tribal regiments. To the Turks, Saladin was an interloper and not really the man who should control this Islamic state. And so Saladin had no choice but to wage holy war against the Crusaders, jihad in the Islamic tradition. He faced a worthy opponent in King Baldwin IV, the ill-fated leper kingdom. But fortune smiled on Saladin, for the leper king died an excruciating death and delivered a crusader king whom Saladin could beat. On July 4th, 1187, Saladin annihilated the feudal host of the Kingdom of Jerusalem on the Horns of Hattin overlooking the Sea of Galilee. The Knights Templars and Hospitallers were massacred. King Guy, the king of Jerusalem, was captured. You can see these are the Turkish horse archers that were so famed. And Saladin cleverly released King Guy because he was far more useful in Crusader ranks rather than languishing in a Muslim prison because no one would bother to pay this king's ransom. The defeat of Hattin marked the end of not only a succession crisis, but also, in many ways, the Crusader states themselves. Only the cities of Tyre, Antioch, and Tripoli escaped capture, and immediately the call went out to Western Europe for a new crusade. Once again, the great kings of Europe pledged their support. Henry II of England, the husband of Eleanor of Aquitaine, had bankrolled King Guy and the Princes of Outremer for almost a generation. He was linked by marriage to all the princes of Outremer and most of those of Western Europe. And in many ways, he was the greatest ruler in the West since Charlemagne. In 1187, he imposed what was known as the Saladin tax in order to defend the Kingdom of Jerusalem against Saladin. And English silver pennies, the so-called short cross pennies, were paid out in enormous amounts, and these coins arrived in such numbers that they set the standard sterling, 92.5% fine, as the preferred silver standard of money and jewelry in the Mediterranean world down to this day. The defeat of Hattin delivered to Saladin essentially all the Crusader states except for those three ports, and the Christians mourned this defeat as a punishment by God. King Guy and his successors reconstituted the Kingdom of Jerusalem without Jerusalem. Instead, they secured the Lebanese ports, which were so vital in the trade between Europe and the Middle East, and the rich hinterland of Cyprus. And the importance of these cities can be seen in the writings of the jurist John Ibelin in the 13th century, who gives a detailed reckoning of the obligations and dues owed to the king paid from the revenues gained from controlling these ports. The Lebanese ports boomed during the later Crusader age. They exported the luxury goods from the Middle East to Western Europe. Spices, jewels, silks, sugar, gum, rice, citrus fruits, medicinals, dried pasta, as opposed to wet pasta, which is an Arabic invention, were exported west. Words such as pepper and sugar entered all European languages as a result of trade at this time. In turn, the Muslim world needed Western metals, silver and gold, to sustain their currencies, steel, iron, copper for weapons, hardwoods, foodstuffs, products of the forest, and above all, slaves, who staffed the armies of the Muslim states, notably Slavs of Eastern Europe or Turks from the eastern zones. The result was that Venice, after defeating Genoa, emerged to dominate the carrion trade between Western Europe and the ports of Lebanon and Alexandria in Egypt. And ironically, Muslim Egypt came to depend on Venice for the materials of war. In the 13th century, Venice exported through the Lebanese ports the silver specie that sustained the revival of silver coinage across the Middle East. The Venetians, ever sensitive to their customers' tastes, even exported silver coins in the form of Muslim coins. As you can see here, the top two coins represent apparently Venetian versions of the Ubaid coins, that is, the coins of the successors of Saladin. Now, these coins came to the attention of Pope Innocent IV in 1250. He was quite upset about it, that Christians were striking coins with Muslim Arabic inscriptions. He outlawed the coins, and as a result, they attempted to appease the Pope by adding a cross to the coins, as you can see in the center. This is one of those numismatic bombs of the 13th century that did not work. We have them in our own currency. And the Muslims just rejected them. And eventually the Venetians just dropped them after a couple of years and went to using bullion. It is often argued in the revisionist scholarship these days that the last several decades or even the whole experience of the Crusades were nothing more than a military annoyance to the fringes of the Islamic world. But this is not so. Christian military achievement is impressive, And the launching of these expeditions were the most ambitious operations undertaken by Westerners since the Roman Empire. Crusader armies adapted to the arid conditions of the Levant and repeatedly defeated far larger Muslim armies. The Italians captured the domination of the Mediterranean, and so the trade routes that became the vital lanes of the European economy until the shift to the North Atlantic in the 15th and 16th centuries. Above all, the Crusaders controlled the ports of the Lebanon and the island of Cyprus, and so they threatened the security of Muslim Egypt, because Christians after 1187 came to believe that Jerusalem could be won on the banks of the Nile. In the 13th century, great crusades set out from Europe to reverse the decision of Hattin by invading Egypt and capturing Damietta, the Egyptian port in the Delta, gateway of Cairo, and forcing a treaty on the Muslims to return Jerusalem. Such was the aim of the Fifth Crusade, supposed to have been commanded by Frederick II, the Seventh Crusade of Louis IX. And it was these Christian threats that were so intolerable that the Mamluk sultans of Egypt waged a methodical war of conquest of all the ports of the Levant and eventually eliminated Christian control. And by 1291, Mamluk slave soldiers captured the last great port, Acre, razed it, and again, the Levantine trade routes now shifted inland. The ports of the Lebanon assume a much lesser role. First under the Mamluk sultans, then under the Ottoman rulers, the Ottoman Sultan Caliphs, Lebanon becomes but a small corner of greater Syria. There is an ever-diminishing pilgrimage trade from Europe that continued into the 19th century, and the legacy of the Crusades had so compromised the native Christian populations of the Middle East that there were massive conversions to Islam, which became the overwhelmingly dominant religion of the region. As for the cities of the Lebanon after the Crusades, they lost their European connections and they languished. And the Ottoman sultans used other ports, Istanbul, Trabzon, Izmir, as Salonika as their main ports. The coinage of the Ottoman Empire was struck in these cities, not in the cities of the Lebanon. And yet Ottoman currency proved quite unstable and ever tied to the currencies of Western Europe. From the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century, the Middle East depended on specie imported from Europe. And so the Venetian gold ducat, which you see here, down to the Austrian silver thaler, arrived as the first of many preferred Western currencies to circulate in the Middle East, down to the US dollar today, and maybe perhaps the euro. So the situation stood till 1918, when Field Marshal Edmund Allenby, the most original Allied commander of the First World War, liberated the cities of Lebanon as he pressed north against the Ottoman armies. A Western army arrived for the fourth time, and so the money and role of Lebanon changed once again. Thank you.
We are now going to march into the Lebanon with General Allenby, and will be conducted by Fred S. Naiden, who's going to speak about Phoenicianism and modern Lebanon.
In 1918, when General Allenby and his army arrived in what is now Lebanon, that nation did not exist. Two Ottoman provinces, one including Damascus to the west, or rather to the east, and including Beirut to the west, that being the second one, occupied most of what is now Lebanon. The Damascus province was Sunni Muslim, but the Beirut province was Sunni and Christian north of Mount Lebanon, that is to say, sections A through C along the coast here on this map. Sections E and F, further south, were Shiite Muslim. Mount Lebanon, you'll see it here in the middle, was unto itself. Its people were schismatic Muslims, the Druze. Besides being religiously distinct, these areas were mutually hostile. In 1822, Damascus and the Shiite South had fought a war against each other. Elsewhere, there was internecine fighting. In 1860, the Christians near Beirut rebelled against their Muslim neighbors and also their Ottoman overlords. The central government, often Constantinople, permitted a massacre of the Christians. The European powers professed themselves appalled. For the time being, they did nothing about it, and the Ottomans remained in charge. But Christian missionaries began to work in the region, Jesuits from France and Presbyterians from the United States. The Presbyterians started the first college or university, what is now the American University in Beirut. Now, In 1918, the powers could do something. Allenby had ejected the Ottomans. What would he do next? He planned to install Britain's Arab retainers, the Hashemite family, as the rulers of Damascus and Beirut. He had already given the Hashemites Jordan, and there was talk of giving them Iraq too. He would go on giving. There was always a Hashemite, he knew, ready to take orders from the general who had overthrown the Ottoman Empire. The American University in Beirut thought Allenby was for Arab nationalism and cheered him on. The Jesuits did not care what Allenby thought. They distributed tiny French flags to the crowds welcoming Allenby's men. But the British found it more expensive to install Arabs than it had been to defeat Ottomans, and so, for their taxpayers' sake, they acquiesced in a peace treaty that assigned Damascus and Beirut to another power, France. The British departed, the French arrived, and for the first time since the Crusades, Lebanon looked to the west. Except there was no Lebanon. The French would have to invent it. They had a reason: to protect the Christians victimized in 1860. But this reason, which was religious, was insufficient. The French Third Republic needed something non-sectarian, something chic. They would get it not from Jesuits, but from a future member of the French Academy, an immortel, Ernst Renan. This photo hints at the many tribulations of the most famous biographer of Jesus since the evangelists. Much of the public did not like the new historical savior of Renan's Life of Jesus. This Christ was a Jew, but that was not all. He was also a Palestinian, at home among pagan Greeks, Canaanites, and Philistines. Renan was the Darwin of historians, showing that the Son of Man had dubious antecedents. Unlike Darwin, however, Renan was disputatious, and so he looked for more pagans to the north of Palestine, and he found the Phoenicians. Today's Lebanon, Renan realized, had been Phoenicia. Could it become Phoenicia again? Some Jesuits preferred describing it as Lebanon after the chief mountain. That would offend none of the region's diverse inhabitants. But Renan prevailed when he insisted that the people of Lebanon would rank as descendants of the Phoenicians, and they would know it. The French would excavate Phoenician sites and show them. Where there had once been Phoenicia, there would now be Phoenicianism. And so the archaeologists invaded. In the same era, Schliemann and the Germans occupied Troy, and Sir Arthur Evans and his British contingent occupied what they called the Cretan palace of Minos. A generation later, the Agora, Athens' marketplace, was still available, and the Americans took it. Then came the Zionists, and even they followed Renan's example. They lacked the money or power to excavate, but they could settle, and they could explain why they should. They descended from the Hebrews. Zionism was the Phoenicianism of the Jews. Renan's example had come to affect much of the Middle East. Not that Renan would put it so baldly. Although disputatious, he was modest. And so, when his hometown commissioned this sculpture, it is merely Zeus's daughter, Athena, who is about to crown him for his labors. Yes, the archaeologists and the Jewish nationalists would have arrived anyway. But Renan showed them how to come as apostles of rebirth. They would go among the Muslims with an un-Muslim mission. They would convert the converted. The terrain was unpromising. As in ancient times, it was easier to go from Baalbek to Cyprus than to go from Baalbek to Beirut. Deforestation had deprived Lebanon of the last of its cedars, and mountain goats destroyed any saplings planted by the occasional nostalgic landlord. When the herders of some of these goats, the Druze from Mount Lebanon, helped slaughter the Christians in 1860, the Ottomans lacked the roads and the police to catch and hang more than a few of them. Far from being traders in the Phoenician or medieval manner, most Lebanese were sharecroppers and slum dwellers. For the Ottomans, the most important city was Damascus, not Beirut or any port. Renan also had very little to go on, just the story of Hiram and a few other biblical kings. That made it harder for him to find what he was looking for. Yet he succeeded. Beirut and the other coastal towns, Mount Lebanon and the valley and heights beyond, many had been Phoenician or Canaanite sites, and even more had been Greco-Roman sites at which Phoenicians had lived. Never mind that many of the ancestors of both Muslims and Christians had immigrated to the region. Herodotus said that the Phoenicians had immigrated. And was it not better to be a Phoenician than to be a Muslim or an Eastern Christian? For Catholics like Renan, it was. Was it not better, too, to be a Phoenician and thus a citizen of a city-state than to be a subject of a Muslim or a Christian monarchy? For liberals like Rahe, it was. And was it not better to be the heirs of the inventors of the alphabet, for so Herodotus said, than to be what the Lebanese were unhappily becoming, unhappily that is for the French, which was the leaders of a revival of Arabic literature? For philologists like Rahe, it was. A latter-day Phoenician would write in a language using the Phoenician alphabet, or using a similar one, which meant a Western alphabet, and in particular meant French. He would be less likely to be an Arab cultural nationalist or any kind of Arab nationalist. Besides, Rahe was sure that a Phoenician literature would crop up. Never mind that the British had found all the literature, and in Assyria at that. Was Rahe an imperialist? No. He was a Republican with a small r. He was also a postmodernist avant la lettre. The people of a nation, he said, quote, must have many things in common, but they must also have forgotten many things, unquote. The Lebanese, for example, must forget that they are mostly Muslim Arab speakers. Phoenicianism would let them forget. With Phoenicianism came other French novelties. In 1863, the year Renan arrived, the first telegraph linked Beirut to Europe. That same year, a new road to Damascus cut a 4-day journey to 12 hours. By 1893, the year of Renan's death, he had published only half of his last book, a 6-volume History of Israel, in which God was incidental. The Ottoman regime had 20 feeble years left. When the French came and replaced the British, they divided the area in two. One part was more same as the interior. The French called this swath Syria, after the Roman province. The population was largely, but not entirely, Sunni Muslim. Syria was a French imperial and not senatorial province, a marcher state, comparable to the Crusaders' county of Edessa. The other part of the coastline, Mount Lebanon and the adjoining Bekaa Valley, was the second French area. A little over half the population here was Christian. When the Christians declined in numbers and became less than half, a constitution imposed by the French kept them in power. Never mind the new Muslim majority. Never mind that this area had never formed a single state. Never mind that the Ottomans had governed it from elsewhere. Never mind that Beirut, the new capital, had never governed more than some one part of it. As Renan said, the Lebanese must forget. This purlieu became Lebanon. Lest confusion between a country and a mountain appear on the national flag, the French put Hiram cedars on the flag and also on coins. The right-hand side shows an ancient Phoenician galley. This motif, of course, comes from ancient coins. Like this one, where you can see the galley on the left, below the towers used to represent the walls of Sidon. The ruined walls of another city, Tyre, plus a temple, appear on French paper money. The language of the money was not Phoenician, but French as well as Arabic. The government of the state resembled the flag and the money. It gave pride of place to Christians and to Western ties, and above all to Beirut. Outside Beirut, Renan made few converts. Some Christians disliked Phoenicianism because it was pagan. The goatherds of Mount Lebanon disliked it because it was urban. Muslims disliked it because it divided Lebanon from Syria. If the French wished to argue power politics and point to new states being established by the British, some Muslims were ready to give the answer of the Assyrian king Sargon II. Cyprus should be added to Lebanon and Syria, creating one entity. If the French wished to argue democracy, let Lebanon conduct a census, which would show that the new state gave more to Christians than the number of Christians justified. After Lebanon became independent in 1943, the arguments went on, but about Israel very soon, as well as about Lebanon. There was an Assyrian answer for Israel, of course. Arab armies ought to march south and conquer it. By the same token, Arabs driven from Israel by the armies of the infidel ought to find refuge in Lebanon. This attitude emerged after the War of Israeli Independence in 1947. After the War of 1967, it led to the establishment of PLO camps in Lebanon. As for democracy, Zionism violated it. It let the dead decide the fate of the living. The coins of the Jewish state illustrate this complaint. Like the cedar and the galley, some of the images on these coins come from antiquity. The first coin issued by Israel, in fact, contained a bunch of grapes copied from a coin issued by the Jewish leader Bar Kokhba during his rebellion against the Romans in 132 to 35 CE. Here you can see Bar Kokhba's coin on the left and center. His palm tree, I think, was the answer to the Lebanese cedar. Here, on the right, is the modern copy. By comparison, coins and notes from Syria include images from antiquity, but also images from the era of Arab rule. Notes from Iraq include this pairing of Saddam Hussein and a winged beast from the palace of Sargon II, the same Assyrian ruler as before. But to my knowledge, Saddam never put the face of Sargon or of any other ancient ruler on notes, coins, or stamps. Naming a division after Nebuchadnezzar was as far as Saddam would go in the way of embarrassing comparisons. By having a friend in Israel, Phoenicianism might as well have had another enemy. Yet Phoenicianism also had an appeal that Rahe and the French never thought of. It defined the Lebanese as merchants, and so it appealed to the commercial center of the country, Beirut. It even appealed to the Muslims in Beirut. For them, Phoenicianism was not a cultural program. It was a reason to put business first and religion second. It was King Hiram's kind of Phoenicianism, unself-conscious and outgoing. It looked to the Mediterranean, but it did not spurn any profits to be made or any bribes to be paid in Asia. Hiram made money from Solomon, and his successors paid tribute to the Assyrians. The Phoenicianism of a Hiram was two-faced. It was a strategy, not a credo. This sort of Phoenicianism, available to Muslims as well as Christians, expressed itself in the career of Rafiq al-Hariri. This Beirut Muslim was the Hiram of his time, the head of the government, the richest man, the civilizer of his neighbors. Hariri was not all surprises. A contract to build a section of the coastal highway went to the wife of Parliament Speaker Nabi Berri, the leading Shiite office holder, at a price estimated to be at least $100 million, higher than the construction costs. Hariri reportedly contributed 3.2 billion francs to the campaigns of French President Jacques Chirac and his allies. Chirac then lent support to Hariri's policy of accommodating Syria and reversed his predecessor's tough stance on the Syrian occupation of one-third of the country. Hariri was relying on his earlier contacts with Assad. He thought that Syria, like France, could be bought. Yet Syria could not. The reason was not just the anti-Phoenician argument that Lebanon and Syria were one country split by the French. Nor was it just the 1958 argument that Egypt and Syria were one country and that Lebanon should be added, the argument that must have occurred to Amun when insulted by the king of Byblos. In 2003, Lebanon's GNP and per capita income were triple Syria's. Syria needed Lebanese jobs, goods, and markets. It could no more afford a border between itself and Lebanon than Mexico could afford an actual rather than a nominal border between itself and the United States. Syria also needed, or thought it needed, military help against Israel. The Lebanese army, a silly part of Lebanon's old regime, could not give this help. The PLO could. Syria used its one-third of Lebanon to supply more guns to these forces. Hariri, the man who had built Assad's palace, did not object. In 2000, Assad died, and his son Bashar took power. He and his Lebanese client, President Rahe, now learned that Hariri would privatize the telecommunications ministry, rich in sinecures. The new owners, of course, would be friends of Hariri. Then 9/11 frightened rich Arabs into taking their money out of the U.S. and Europe and moving it to Hariri's banks and other businesses in Lebanon. Hariri, emboldened, proposed further privatizations. The richest of all Lebanese would now be more powerful than either the president of Lebanon or the president of Syria. But 9/11 brought other changes to Lebanon, too. Ill will towards the West led to the disappearance of such tokens as the Phoenician galleys on Lebanese coins and notes. It also led to goodwill towards Syria. Once, this would not have affected Hariri, but now it did. Worried about Syrian elements in the intelligence services, Hariri installed equipment that deactivated all cell phones near his limousine. Less formidable vehicles had been frequent targets. Had the failure to privatize telecommunications been ominous? On February 14, 2005, he was traveling through the downtown district being rebuilt by Solidere. The company's biggest shareholder swung past ruins set off in traffic circles onto the Seaside Avenue, passing the Phoenicia Intercontinental Hotel. On the opposite avenue, on the right-hand side of this image stood the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, typical of the firms that had followed rich Arabs to Lebanon. All the cell phones on the street presumably went out. The blast echoed as far as the hills on the outskirts of Mount Lebanon. So little was left of Hariri that it made no difference that his Saudi-style funeral excluded burial of the remains. Anger at the assassination led to the protests symbolized by the cedar tree. At its peak, this outburst of Phoenicianism was so strong that Syrian troops withdrew. But the withdrawal of these troops did not put an end to claims upon Lebanon coming from Asia. Another part of Lebanon's Muslim population, the Shiites, remained under arms. Their militia, controlled by Hezbollah, the party of God, defied all Lebanese and international wishes. They had nothing to do with the killing of Hariri, but they did kill the so-called Cedar Revolution. After that, they aligned themselves with Syria, and they hobbled Hariri's successors. This Shiite response brings us to the present. It also introduces a new chapter in the relations between the Mediterranean and the interior. Along with Iran and Iraq, southern Lebanon is the home of the particular Shiite belief that animates Hezbollah. This kind of Shiism, often called Twelver Shiism, recognizes 12 imams, beginning with the first male convert to Islam, Ali, and with his son Hussein, killed at Karbala in Iraq while fighting to become caliph in 680. In 874, the 12th and last of these imams disappeared. Perhaps because he was only 7 years old, he was able to communicate for 67 more years, but then fell silent. He is the hidden imam, the Mahdi against whom a young Churchill soldiered in the Sudan. And he is the same authority whom Shiite clerics represent in southern Lebanon, but also in Iraq and Iran. Until he returns, the Shiites must practice dissimulation. They keep their religious beliefs and customs to themselves, the better to endure persecution, and they let others govern them. This is the first, slower part of the Shiite story, the epic of patience. Then comes the second, quicker part, the season of impatience. When the Mahdi returns, the Shiites must mobilize. They must no longer keep their secrets or endure persecution. They must govern themselves. Or such was the view until 1958. That year, when Hariri was off in Saudi Arabia making his fortune, an Iraqi Shiite cleric, Musa al-Sadr, came to Lebanon from the Shiite seminary at Karbala. He appears here on the left. He brought a new doctrine, that of his cousin, Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, shown in this same slide on the right. Muhammad Baqir taught that the Shiites need not wait for the Mahdi's return. If they could take power, they ought to mobilize earlier. Other Iraqi and Iranian-trained clerics came to Lebanon to learn the doctrine. Two of the sons of the Ayatollah Khomeini came there in the 1960s and 70s. In those decades, it was easier to debate and organize in Lebanon than in the Iraq of Saddam Hussein or the Iran of the Shah. The debate soon centered on the government of Lebanon. Should the Shiites accept this government with its guarantees for Christians and also Sunnis, or should they anticipate the return of the Imam and mobilize? The al-Sadrs split. Muhammad Baqir said, mobilize. Musa said, not yet. When the Lebanese Shiites first took up arms, they followed Musa. Their movement, Amal, participated in parliament, and Hariri bribed them, the same as the rest. Then came the revolution in Iran. Its leaders had mobilized without delay, as Muhammad Baqir would have done. Shortly after this revolution, Hezbollah emerged in Lebanon. The future leader of this party, Nasrallah, had just come to Lebanon from an Iraqi seminary, and so did other leaders. These leaders followed Muhammad Baqir. Hezbollah therefore became the party of mobilization in Lebanon. Only one Shiite party of mobilization, that of Iran, controls a government. The Lebanese party controls a region. The Iraqi party, led by Muqtada al-Sadr, a third leader from that family, Muhammad's son, controls neighborhoods in Baghdad. That would seem to make all the difference. The Iranians have an army, the Lebanese have mostly suicide bombers, and the Iraqis have a militia dwarfing the Lebanese forces. The Iranians oppose the United States, the Lebanese oppose the Israelis, and the Iraqis oppose the United States and also some of their Sunni countrymen. But these political and military differences do not spell disunion among these three parties. The three collaborate. Lebanese leaders come from Iraq, and Iranian leaders train in Lebanon. There are, to sum up, three al-Sadrs. Here they appear together, Muqtada is to the right. Compared with these men, Sargon II was unsure of himself. Sargon did not have that one God behind him. An illustration of Shiite collaboration appears in the stamps and bills of the one party able to issue them, the Iranians. This Iranian stamp of 1987 reprises the symbol of both Hezbollah and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Mosques appear, but no churches, synagogues, or ruins of ancient temples. No leaders appear other than the leaders of the Party of Mobilization, notably the Ayatollah Khomeini, here on the top. The people appear praying or marching, as in figure 7, at this figure rather, on the bottom. In the next, May Day gets the Islamic touch. I've elongated this picture just a bit to show the length of the parade. The Shah, in contrast, preferred ancient company. There he is atop, and the ancient company below. Here I elongate the side of the note, showing one of his Persian predecessors at a parade of a different kind, the presentation of subjects doing obeisance. On the right, a subject blows the Persian king a kiss, a gesture that did not survive Iran's change in regime. Will Hezbollah imitate these stamps and bills? This poster shows verve. 3 coins become 6 bombs. Yet the example set by Iran suggests that the money issued by Hezbollah will be more valuable to collect than to spend. When Lebanon has been part of the Mediterranean, the money has been sound. The talents of the Phoenicians were sound, and so was the coinage of the Greeks and Romans, the Franks and the French and the Lebanese republics. These monies served the needs of Spain to the west, and the Queen of Sheba, and the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank coming from the east. The coinage of the Arabic and Ottoman eras was mostly unsound. It served local needs. There will doubtless be more such unsound coinage under Hezbollah. Or is the position of Hezbollah ambiguous? As a small, unrecognized state, it resembles the West Bank and Gaza, 2 other small, unrecognized states. It also lies between Israel and the Lebanese central government, 2 small, recognized states. The total number of states in the region has climbed to 5. This figure compares with the total for ancient Phoenicia, or for the total that Professor Harl gave us for the peak of the Crusader incursion in the medieval period. But how long will any of these 5 states last? This was the question, or very nearly the question, with which we began. The answer is that the Levantine coast tends to have numerous states or no states. If there are numerous states, they can defend each other. Failing that, they can tolerate each other. Either policy will gain them time. Any transition from west to east will go slower. Fewer will emigrate in a Lebanese, Jewish, or Palestinian diaspora. Of course, some of these states hate each other. They also need each other. None of them should expect to outlive its enemies.
Major funding for this program was provided by the William S. Paley Foundation. Additional support was provided by the Tulane University Department of History, the Tulane University Department of Classics, and the A.B. Freeman School of Business.
Think Forward. Think Research Channel.